Hey everyone, today we're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the discussion on opportunity cost and more specifically the comparative advantage. A little bit more than the speed run I did in the entire chapter overview. So in the book it talked about Ruby and how much she could produce. If she spent all 8 hours working, she could either produce up to 48 ounces of potatoes or only 24 ounces of meat. Now, over here in the opportunity cost, that means the opportunity cost of producing a single ounce of potatoes is 1.5 ounce of meat. So she gives up half an ounce of meat in order to produce an ounce of potatoes. So that means producing 1 ounce of meat has an opportunity cost of 2 ounces of potatoes. Frank, on the other hand, if he did all of his resources in one good, could produce 32 ounces of potatoes over those 8 hours, or only 8 ounces of meat during that same window. That means his opportunity cost for producing an ounce of potatoes is a 1/4 ounce of meat. However, to produce a single ounce of meat, he gives up the opportunity to make 4 ounces of potatoes. You can see that's quite the contrast. When Frank is producing by himself, he only gives up a 1/4 ounce of meat to produce an ounce of potatoes, where Ruby gives up a 1/2 ounce or twice as much meat to produce a single ounce of potatoes. So you remember from previous chapter discussion, the discussion on PPFs or production possibilities frontier. And I've recreated this using the online tool DESMOS for graphing. And you can see here in the black line, if Frank produces nothing but meat, he'll produce right here 8 ounces of meat or 32 ounces of potatoes. And Ruby would produce 24 ounces of meat or 48 ounces of potatoes. However, based on their preferences, because most people don't want to eat all potatoes or all meat, they do a mixture, and their ideal combination would be Frank producing 16 ounces of potatoes and 4 of meat, and Ruby would be 24 and 12. So based on their preferences and their PPF, this chart represents how many ounces of potato each would produce, which we just saw at their optimum points on the previous graph. We can see that Ruby can produce more potatoes or more meat than Frank, so she has an absolute advantage in production of either good. So does that mean that she should produce either those goods or both? So as I mentioned, Frank doesn't have to give up as much meat in order to produce an ounce of potatoes compared to how much Ruby gives up. And let's revisit what I already discussed. So if Frank puts all of his resources into producing potatoes, he'll make 32, and Ruby will make 24 ounces of meat. So should they trade, or should they remain independent? Well, there's a trade offered up in the chapter where Ruby suggests, hey, you produce nothing but potatoes. Focus on what you've got the comparative advantage in. And then trade me, Ruby, 15 of those potatoes, and you consume 17, which you can see is higher than the 16 he was going to produce if he didn't trade and produce this optimal combination. And for meat, Frank won't produce any. Ruby will produce a mixture of 18 ounces of meat and 12 ounces of potatoes. Ruby will then trade 5 ounces of meat for those 15 ounces of potatoes she got from Frank. And that means that she'll produce she'll consume 17 ounces of potato, which is more than the 24 she was going to consume independently, and she'll consume 18 ounces of meat rather than the 12 she was going to consume otherwise. Frank consumes 17 ounces of potatoes and 5 of meat from Ruby, which is greater than 4. So they didn't put any extra work or resources into production. They both worked the same, but with trade, they both consume more of each good. Ruby benefits by getting 3 more ounces of potatoes, and then Frank gets an additional ounce of each potatoes and meat, and 1 more. Ruby gets 1 more of meat. So they both end up better off without trade. Now, of course, we're assuming that there aren't any costs involved with trade in this example. So when does this work? When does it make sense to trade? Well, whenever you can agree on a trade price that falls between each person's opportunity cost. So on slide 5, I mentioned that the opportunity cost of producing 1 ounce of meat was 4 ounces for Frank, but only 2 ounces for Ruby. So as long as they agree on a trade price between 2 and 4, then it makes sense for them to trade. In this example, they were agreeing to trade 3 ounces of potatoes for 1 ounce of meat. This falls between 2 and 4, so they both benefit. So again, this is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Producing less of something that you can than you can, because Ruby could produce more of either good, but she's producing less than she can of one good, and Frank is producing less meat than he could, so that they can then trade and both be better off. So this is a way to get gains from trade without increasing the input you put into it. So I hope that makes it clear. If not, let me know and we can discuss more examples. Thank you.